All right, so let's talk about the return on investment of Kanban. All right, so does this work? Show of hands, who's been asked, doesn't have to be about Kanban, but just in your career, show me the business case.
On Friday.
Just like on Friday. All right. Sorry, I didn't see the side of the room. Can I see your hands again? So almost everybody, right? And it was back in 2018. We were working with a very large fintech on their transformation efforts, and they were thinking about Kanban. And the sponsor was saying, I need some help with this. This seems to be the stumbling block. We need to have a compelling message here. It's almost like, kind of to steal from Chet, we needed a story to tell around the return on investment, right? This had to be something that was obvious and clear. Have you heard kind of wishy-washy answers to transformations like, hey, everyone will feel better, we'll work harder. Yeah, it's all about culture, right? Good enough answers? Maybe sometimes, not always, right? So there is a story that needs to be told around the actual returns. Why would an organization go through risk of a change? Why would they put their faith in Kanban? And what are they going to get out of it? All right. So I'm glad that Chet's not in the room because I think I'm like ruining the whole approach to storytelling. I'm chasing to the very end. The spoiler alert. The results are the benefits are big. The cost of investment is quite small. So small that even nonprofits can do it, right? And so, we're going to focus on both sides, but mostly on the benefits because that's where all the action is, really. That's where the big part of the story unfolds, and it's going to, if I'm going to use this story analogy, it's going to come out in about 4 acts. So let's talk about benefits first, and then we're going to talk about the cost side at the end of the presentation. So we start by positioning Kanban. Like, what is it, right? Well, we could look at it from the perspective of an approach to change that is very different from a standard model, right? So a lot of people in this room have seen big J-curve changes, the dangers around that, the risks that are unmanaged. And so Kanban positions itself to say, hey, you know what? We're not going to expose you to this kind of risk. We're going to chase improvements. And key to this ongoing improvements is they come regularly, they come early. There is a translation from that thinking to ROI. There's going to be a path of ROI associated with that continuous improvement. If not, there's something wrong. We're going to manage risk. We're going to do things like preventing regression. So up comes something that is very convenient to layer in on top of this, and that is the Kanban maturity model. So if you think about an organization going through ongoing change and improvements, this is an organization going through increasing maturity. Now, is it as elegant as, first 0 and then 1, then 2? I mean, the size of the boxes are probably very different from organization to organization, but the path is the same. So KMM gives us a model to look at this path of increasing maturity. All right, so if we have this, we also need to understand, how this gets used. So if we're thinking KMM, there's also 2 big caveats there. There are no shortcuts, right? So the ROI story isn't going to be a one of going from 0 to 3. And the benefits that we're going to be talking about aren't going to be enabled without some form of help. So that will show up in the cost. And like the short answer to the help is probably someone with one of those white lanyards hanging around giving some sort of advice. It doesn't even have to be a lot, but someone with one of those white lanyards is probably enough in most cases. All right, so let's have a look at this further. Let's talk about the first act of returns. You're starting out, you're introducing some basic Kanban practices in an organization with the goal of reaching maturity level 1. What does that look like? What are you getting? This act I'm calling overhead. So that's the theme associated with the returns coming out of this type of Kanban. Very easy to get to, implementable just about everywhere. So we start with having things like simple boards. Who here has seen a to-do doing done board in their career? Right? They're not without value. They're starting to show stuff, right? They do things like making utilization more visible. Who is working? Gives you the opportunity to make some decisions around how we're going to reduce things like overloading people, get people a little bit focused. Both from who's working and perhaps managers who are participating in really trying to make sure that all these things are getting across the finish line. So this kind of visibility starts to introduce the possibility for collaboration, right? So again, a big forgiveness for those who have taken some Kanban training classes. You've probably seen these patterns before. But we got to connect them to where it's going from a returns perspective, right? So opportunities for collaboration show up. We get to see who needs help, what's not moving. And at this level, this focus becomes something interesting. We're thinking classically of Kanban being, hey, you know what, we're going to get lots of stuff done and things like that. But at this early stage, when we start to look at the empirical evidence of where these returns are coming from, and this is us over many, many years doing this across so many companies, it starts to look a little bit like this instead. Whose calendar looks like this? Show of hands. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, has your calendar looked like this in the past? All right. Yeah, I know. I was trying, I got tired putting in all the meetings, right? So, yeah. So if you see a calendar like this, it might even be a smoking gun that suggests you're not even outside of ML1. This is the kind of overhead generated with too much work in progress and not enough focus. Let's have another meeting, right? Let's do our Scrum of Scrums, Kanban of Kanbans, review the Gantt chart for dependencies, whatever you're doing, right? There's an overhead associated with this lack of focus. And here is some basic Kanban showing up and giving you focus. That's the first casualty that Kanban is trying to eliminate. It's trying to get rid of all this overhead. So, generally what you start to see is this pattern of, hey, you know what? When we do work and we do we commit to a lot of stuff, we're actually experiencing reverse economies of scale. The more we commit to, the more unfocused we are, the more the overhead is there. We got to hire an army of project managers to deal with all this overhead. Scrum of Scrums, whatever it is that you're doing, right? So we put our place in a position of getting our overhead down. And this starts to bring in our operating costs. This is the overhead required to just get anything done. And when we start to look at this, it's non-trivial, right? About 50% reduction in the amount of overhead at this very basic level of Kanban. So to help kind of illustrate the magnitude of this impact, we built a bit of a model here that says, okay, let's imagine we've got this theoretical department and organization. It's got a $20 million annual budget, and its overhead to run that from a management overhead perspective, about 20%. We've introduced Kanban, and it's dealing with that cost. at this fairly low maturity level. What does that look like after 18 months? That's $2.5 million in the opening act of our story. I don't know about how big the companies you guys work for, but in a lot of places, we don't ignore $2.5 million, right? And this is just perhaps a department in a broader organization. So the key thing to look at this is, so I don't want you guys to go out and say, hey, you know what, here you're going to save $2.5 million, because it's going to be there are going to be variables in your context that will make this number go up or down. But the order of magnitude is there, so keep that in mind. And keep in mind that in this early stages, the returns are coming primarily from managing your costs, right? There's no market excellence. There's no any of this other stuff. It's a lot of money, but it's purely from managing costs, right? But it is good return. So, okay, we could stop here. And in fact, a lot of organizations that don't work with one of the white lanyard people do stop here because they don't have a path forward beyond this. But if we're going to continue, we're going to get to the next chapter of the story. And this one's called flow. So flow gets you more stuff. Before that focus got you some amount of control over your overhead, and that was good, and it was a non-insignificant amount of number. Flow starts to get you access to different things. So we start to realize things that our focus on teams will only get us so far. We visualize the team, and now we realize there are a few other problems. One team's blocked. It's generally another team's to do, right? Who here is in a situation where you work with a group and they need maybe it's from a third-party vendor or something stuck, and they need to ask someone else to participate, right? All the time. That's just the nature of getting things done. So we say, okay, well, that's something that we need to figure out how to solve. Or another team's done is another team's to do. Do you guys experience handovers in your world? Looking for nods, yeah? A few nods? Come on, all the time, right? So this is interesting because when you start to look at the data, the delays between these groups, in many cases, actually in most cases, are a bigger source of delays than the delays inside the teams themselves. The gap of time between these different structures is bigger than the gaps in times within the structures. So at this level of Kanban, we start to maybe be a little bit more mature and say, hey, you know what? I'm doing stuff, and then it goes to you, and maybe we'll visualize it together, and then we'll see how this flows a little bit more end-to-end. We might call this aggregated team Kanban, but essentially trying to visualize more of what's going on, right? And so now it affords us the ability to manage flow in a way that previously we couldn't. We were trying to manage productivity from a team and get them focused, but here we're now managing flow where things are maybe irrespective of which team is working on what. We start to look at things like, maybe multiple groups operating more as one unit. Things like if one group is working at a different rate than another, and there's unevenness, maybe we're going to fix that, right? I think I always use this quote from Alexei where, the story of the left shoe factory and the right shoe factory, right? So perhaps the left shoe manufacturing should be at the same rate as the right shoe manufacturing because your customers only buy pairs of shoes after all. So being able to start to think about broadening your scope and seeing how things are flowing. Now, you do that, and now you have the potential for some significant increases to your throughput. Fewer items are getting stuck because you have the opportunity to deal with them. You didn't see them getting stuck before. So when you start to observe the impact of this kind of model, now throughputs can be doubling. Dealing with those delays gets you into market sooner. So lead time reductions, somewhere between the 10 to 50%, even at this non-service lens of the problem. It's just about managing flow across more than just one team. So things are reaching the hands of your customer faster, and I don't know about you guys. Who here runs a business? Show of hands. When your customers get things faster, they like you more? Yeah. Tends to affect their selection. They might choose you next time again, right? So we start to see this, and now we can layer in some more benefits. Throughput increasing, lead time increasing, or lead time reducing. Our model is growing. So still the same time period, but somewhere in that time period, we've shifted up maturity. We've gotten to level 2. We've addressed lead time, throughput. Cost controls are now sharing the stage with actual real growth. Market growth is starting to show up at this level, right? So, this is about growing the business, developing new customers, having your products in market sooner, reaping whatever benefits your products are intended to bring you. All right, not bad. I mean, this is already good, right? This might be enough to just stop the story, and an executive might say, well, I'm sold. But we can continue the story because, well, there's more maturity to be had. Although, at the same time, getting from 2 to 3 is a bit of a challenging threshold, and maybe not everyone's going to be able to pull it off. One of the great things is if you don't pull it off, it's not like you're left with in a place where you have nothing to show for it. All right, so it's like prizes all along, or maybe like a children's birthday party where everyone gets a loot bag. It doesn't matter if it's not your birthday or not. So let's look at what it looks like before. So what's the theme here? This is a theme of value, right? So if we're going to encapsulate what the returns look like as we get more mature with our practices, we start to have access to greater value. We start to have the customer play a central role in our thinking. We're obsessed with this journey between I need this and I got it. That's what this level of maturity looks like. We're obsessed with that journey. And we realize that that journey is often complicated and has to be figured out. There's some implications. Going back to the business owners, do your customers care how hard you worked? No, right? That's not the thing that's going to get you leverage. You also realize that you got a bunch of services that have to work together in order for this externally exposing service to your paying customers to work. And the third implication is it doesn't matter what business you're in. Who's here been like in a conversation that says, you know what, I'm not sure if Kanban is right for us because we're a product company or we're product-centric. Who's had that conversation? Yeah, and then you say, well, how are those products built? Oh, yeah, they seem to be the outcome of services. So the fundamental realization that this journey is always taking place in an organization. It's a question of whether we want to accept that as a reality and whether we want to visualize and manage it. And at this level, we make that the thing that we're going to accept. So we're going to improve this flow of value from this I need it to I got it. Cool. If only it was so simple. So we like to think it's like the picture on the left, but it's usually the picture on the right. And so we got to navigate this complex network. And so we got to figure out how we're going to do it. And this is not a talk about all the tools available in Kanban, But we are going to position it from a perspective of, to manage that value, you're going to have to look at this problem from a bit of a tug of war. There's going to be a lot of demand. There's going to be so much capability you have. And it doesn't matter what you do with your capability, you will always have more demand than capability to deliver, right? If you find that you have more capability than demand, it's probably a sign that you're going to go out of business. So healthy organization, more demand than capability. And you're not sure if that's true, ask yourself if you have any unmet technical debt in your organization. Why didn't you do it? Well, because we were busy, right? Too much demand. So we look at that and say, well, you know what? Our bet here is to increase the balance between these two things. We're not going to make them balanced, but we're going to make them more balanced. We do that by looking at both sides. We're going to do demand shaping, higher quality options, being committed to capability improvements. We're visualizing services end to end, not caring where the delays are coming from, managing them out. We're finding our sources of variability, figuring out ways to get them out of our process. So this is Kanban's biggest place of leverage. This is the sweet spot, right? So it's kind of cool where we see that there's great returns up until now, even if you don't get it, but this is the big prize. If you can get here, man, oh man, it's something to celebrate. Customers are going to be choosing you more often, and you've recognized your services and you're managing them. So let's go back to looking at those benefits again and think about the value associated with managing shaping your demand. You're not abandoning things. You're not investing time on things that don't make you money or things that you don't end up delivering for a wide variety of reasons. So value is entering your system a lot more. We choose the right things. Our ability to get to market is now faster because we are visualizing and managing the whole delivery chain. Tremendous growth in lead time reduction beyond the previous flow-based perspective at ML2. Throughput of value goes up. Your customers not only like the speed, they like the quality, but more importantly, they like the consistency. So a lot of presentations around this week about tails and whether they're cats or not. This is about not having those tails as long, right? So that's our Kanban geek term for more predictability, promises you can keep. So there's starting to be a bit of growth in the ROI that I'm going to talk to you really quickly in the next slide, but also something more that I'm going to talk to you, expand on in a bit. So ROI, yes, but is there something more than ROI that's emerging here? So the big takeaway here, again on our model of a $20 million department, is obviously there's a big number that showed up. Much bigger returns than the previous two levels. But growth is the dominant category now. That's the big takeaway, right? So again, your numbers will be different, but the idea to understand here is at maturity level 3, your money is not being generated by being more efficient. It's about being fitter in the marketplace and growing your business. That is where this level of maturity gets you, right? So this is where statements like I said before about this being the Kanban sweet spot start to be clear when we just look at the numbers. All right, so I've expanded this beyond a year and a half to 2 years. Unlikely that you're full on at maturity level 3 in the first year and a half. Maybe even 2 years might be stretching, but again, this is a model that you can grow and contract as you see fit based on what you think your journey will look like. in whatever organizations you support. So let's look at the pattern. Overhead comes first, then flow, then value. You can't get to value if you haven't dealt with the first two. Right? Remember the whole thing I said earlier about shortcuts? There aren't any. Right? So you're not getting the value if flow is unmanaged, and you're not getting those returns already, and you're not getting the flow if overhead is all over the place and you're unfocused. Throughout this whole pattern, returns are early, they're sizable, and eventually you get to that third act where growth starts to eclipse cost savings. Now we're kind of in unicorn territory. Level 4. Who here has actually been part of a level 4 organization? One person, right? The unicorns only show up at Kanban conferences. A little bit harder to answer that question outside, right? So, it's a much harder place to get to. Typically 3 is much more common, and that's hard already as it is. But let's look at 4. The theme here is one of resilience. So we've gotten through our overhead, and we've gone through flow and value and looking at services and making those fit. Why should we go further? And the problem is time and markets. Time being the source of change, right? Markets change, sentiments change, your capabilities may change, all sorts of stuff. So this level of maturity is about maintaining that over time. If we're a market leader now, will we continue to be that in 10 years? It's not about having that 10-year plan, really, but it's about having the ability to examine changes that are happening and being able to pivot as required. So this level of maturity is about sustaining positions and ultimately about surviving all sorts of change. You had to go through all those other levels of maturity to get here because there is some very serious leadership maturity that's required to enter this zone. And if you don't have these, well, the good news is the previous maturity levels are kind of the training ground to get here, right? So, this is a great, for the group that's ML4, it's always a great thing to say, hey, do we have this, right? Is this what our leadership culture looks like? So here are kind of 5 big ones to kind of focus on. Tactics, they're cool, but long-term survival of the business is paramount. Decision-making focuses on that. When we make decisions on what to do, we don't focus on what our competitors are doing, but we focus on what our customers need. Has anyone been part of presentations where you had to compare what other people in the industry were doing? Yeah, signs of lower maturity. There is a general curiosity within leadership of how the work gets done. There is not like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to abstract that. I'm not part of that. I want to know. The damage of unfit services are clear. So there's a lot of focus on ensuring that unfit services are figured out and dealt with. And then finally, your time horizon and patience to see things through is much greater. So again, starting to think about, to get this kind of ongoing resilience, you probably need a mix of leadership qualities that look like this. So we improve our decision making here. And a lot of organizations, it's very easy to choose good options versus bad. What about good versus good? That's a bit tougher, right? Should we do this? Should we do that? I just was reading an article this morning about a famous coffee chain that started selling, they're introducing pizza. And I'm like, oh my God, they're introducing pizza. They're a coffee shop. Probably did not think decisions from this perspective. Sure, there was a tactic there, but is it good for your survival? So organizations at this level, they're starting to think about making decisions from multiple perspectives of managing risk. They have clearly defined strategies, and that's integrated in their decision making. They're thinking about purposes of their customers. Whatever risks that the organization may face need to be hedged. They're not going to expose themselves to ruin through any kind of decision making. They can leverage all these fancy Kanban geeky charts that we see, not just produce them, because you can produce them at all levels, but leverage them. And leveraging them means improving your decision-making quality. Leveraging them means our tail has been shrunk so that predictions can be made. Right? So the thing about predictions is not to get better at predictions, but to make predictions easier. Right? You can't really make good predictions with high variability, so you've got that under control. You've got reliability with your customers. Delays are understood, managed out. So let's look at the ROI returns here. I'm having a bit of a joke with you. At ML4, nobody cares about ROI. That's not the story you need to tell for ML4. And this was the edge of what I was saying that was showing up at ML3, in that this is about resilience. So the return here is not a dollar return, but a capability return. A capability in an organization that is emerging here. The recognition that running a business is about taking risks and getting good at taking those risks, managing the exposure, adapting the changes to your marketplace. So here's the pattern. 4 acts like I promised you. We start with overhead, flush with cash, a little bit more in flow, value. We got a bit of a tsunami there. And resilience keeps the party going. That is the potential story and the path of Kanban in an organization. Now, it needs to be sustained. It needs to be supported. So let's talk about the other part, right? I promised you that I was going to talk about, the benefits, but we should talk about the costs, right? So let's talk about that. So a theme here is the misspelled word services. I'm just noticing that now. So we start by thinking about how would an organization need support. And so you want to think about it by looking at 2 angles and a bunch of ratios and targets, in a way. To say, well, an organization will probably need a mix of these 3 things. Some training, some consulting, some coaching to develop the capability, introduce it, sustain it. And there are 3 big groups in an organization. There's the executive senior leadership. There are people who are part of teams, do the work that services are producing, and then there is management. As you are looking at growing this maturity, there is a view on how to scale that impact in your organization. And so you start to think about it, well, scaling is a bit of a tricky thing. unless you kind of simplify the idea and say, well, how are we scaling? And there's a few different aspects to keep in mind. So when people say, oh, we're using Kanban more and more, well, what do you mean? There could be height, which is where the Kanban is done. Is it done through portfolios and entire lines of business, or is it just a team doing it or individuals? Could be about width. How much have you visualized? One team, aggregated 2 teams, the whole service chain? Knowledge, who knows what? 150 plus practices, which of those are we good at? And depth, finally, how many of our services have adopted Kanban? And that's the driver, that right there, the depth. So keeping it simple, how do we scale? We scale by Kanbanizing one service at a time. So depth becomes the thing that's pushing us forward. The other 3 dimensions of height, width, and knowledge maintain congruence with the depth that's growing. We keep the right amount of that to track the depth that's happening. As more and more services are Kanbanized, we may need to do more in height. As more and more services are Kanbanized, our width and our opportunities for width grows. As more and more services are Kanbanized, our knowledge needs to be increased as we expose ourselves to the need for more of our Kanban tools and techniques. So there's a bit of a momentum going there with driving scale that way. So you could go and throw an army at an organization, and given how good the benefits are, you might still turn out on top, but you don't have to. If you look at this one service at a time pattern, you start to realize that there is a pattern for that service. And if you start to look at those 3 services you can offer an organization, whether it's external support or internal, training to get leaders of services developing a common language probably looks like KSD, but it doesn't have to be. Getting a service Kanbanized, probably using something like static as a workshop, but it doesn't have to be. And then coaching, but not full-time. Coaching is targeted at feedback loops. You support leaders by helping them design the experiments for change, and then coming back after a period of time and reflecting on those experiments for change and designing the next ones. Based on those feedback loops, what has changed? Should we continue this experiment? Should we alter it somehow? Replace it with something else? Layer up. So particularly if you are hiring high-cost external Kanban consultants, you're paying for those feedback loops. So there's the containment of cost. Maybe they're showing up once every 4 or 5 weeks. Probably more. So you'll see that the gap is growing in this model over time. The cadence starts to expand as the maturity in the service expands. As the maturity of the service expands, opportunities for more training show up. Perhaps KSI, perhaps KMM, KCP, what have you. But here's the 2 levers of containing that investment. Managers of services, or whoever's taking responsibility, if you want to know who that is, Fernando had a great talk called Finding Your SDM. So you got to find that person. And then supporting that person. So you're limiting the target of, you're not sending a whole organization, everyone through training. You're not coaching everyone. You're developing leadership capability, initially through training, some active consulting, and then a journey together through successive feedback loops. You avoid some anti-patterns. If we overly focus on teams, we'll get stuck at ML1. So if we want to get past that, we're going to have to think about broadening our horizon. We're not going to go with the full-time embedded coaching route. You don't need to sit at a desk keeping the seat warm to make a group more agile or more Kanbanized or whatever it is, right? It's about developing those leadership capabilities. In-house training, this is a tricky one in that a lot of times organizations will focus on the cost side, the denominator, focus on trying to save some money and build in-house training capability at the cost of the numerator and slowing themselves down. Conversely, the other side of that is failing to actually develop your in-house KCP talent. I think there was a stat that was shared on Sunday that it was like over 2,000 KCPs now, right? Sorry? 1,200, right? But targeting at least 2,000, right? So here are the people who will sustain the maturity in the organization and provide those feedback loops. And then finally, this idea of a grand transformation that we've been talking about, as in, hey, you're not going to go from 0 to 3 or 1 to 4 or what have you. It's going to be one service at a time, increasing maturity over time. There we go. So coaching is a lion's share. If you were to, I threw in some costs, not our costs, but just industry average costs of consulting and training into this model. And so coaching tends to be the lion's share. Training is a much smaller portion of the budget. Remember how it's been contained. We are talking about training leaders and managers, SDMs, SRMs, people who are going to work with others. And then you contrast, so it adds up in this model to about 1.2 over this 2-year period. Now, if you contrast that against your typical embedded agile coaching approach, which is have the bum in the seat all week long, and I've used a rate that's about half of a Kanban consulting rate because, let's be honest, agile coaching is a bit of a commodity these days, and it is a bit cheaper. So, even with that, it's much more expensive. So, there's what route would you take? Targeted. Well, you're going to save a lot of money if it's targeted, one service at a time. You're thinking about broadening it that way. And finally, we get to look at the whole thing. Like I said, big number, small number. So as I leave you, just some key messages from the talk. You want to think about your returns and the implementation of Kanban as this ongoing process of increasing maturity. There is no big prize at the end of returns, but the returns are early, ongoing, sizable, but initially they're going to be coming from overhead management. Your approach optimally is scaling one service at a time, and you make that focus through focusing on your leadership and developing their skills so they can actually Kanbanize those services. All right, thank you. One of the things I had as a challenge for this talk was this is about 40% of the original slides I built, and it was a lot to go through. So if you want to go into a little bit more depth, there's a URL with that QR code that goes into a bunch of articles that I wrote about this, and so it's a little bit less compressed than the talk if you want to have a look at that. And so I don't know, how are we for time for questions?
We've got about 10 minutes, a little
All
under
right.
10 minutes for some questions. Anybody have any questions? Back here.
First of all, thank you. I really like your presentation. have one question. We use multiple terms there, like a product, teams, and then as we grow in the Kanban maturity model, we were talking about from teams to flow to services and then further up. So how do we map that product view into this Kanban maturity model?
Map the product view. Okay, so I think I would say first of all, you don't map the product view. So I would say I would look at the question where someone would say, well, let's map the product view, or let's map the project view, or whatever, right? Fundamentally, is the realization that the health of the products, the health of the projects, are a result of the underlying services, right? So we are talking about service capability maturity growing, and the result, products surfacing, projects being delivered, right? So I spent an earlier part of my career in project management, and you couldn't project manage your way through bad capabilities, right? Ultimately, the underlying services needed to be fit, and that's the focus. It's a great question.
Do you
I
have
think
any
Dave had a
other-
question over here.
Oh, here we go. Yes.
Maybe it's in your slides, but I'm curious how you might have changed your words, and this might be, I don't need you to rewrite your whole thing, but for a non-profit-oriented organization, municipal government, some of the words or some of the concepts, but I still think that there's...
Yeah, you know what? Again, this is a story that has a particular set of readers in mind, right? The NGOs may not be the group. However, there's a big lesson in here. I'll talk to you about what it is. So this model, right, we were approached by an NGO that had almost no money. And they said, we want to get support from you, and nobody will talk to us because we only have about 15 grand. Right? But we really think that we could really benefit from Kanban. And we're like, yeah, of course, let's talk about it. So we developed this model for them. We gave them a year of coaching, almost a year. It was actually about 10 months. A year of coaching for what is typically a week's worth of consulting in the Agile space, right? How did we do it? These feedback loops, right? So we had some initial things around developing common language, a few tools, not too many because they couldn't have full-blown training. But they said, okay, well, what are the first changes we're going to try? Visualize a few things. I'll see you in 6 weeks. I'll charge you 2 hours. Come in. Let's reflect on how those things went in. What are we going to do next? I'll see you in 6 weeks. And so on, right? So I think in that group, I wouldn't tell the story like this, but there's obviously lots of lessons there, for sure. Hopefully that answered your question, Dave. All right, cool.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions today?
So the non-profit approached you for this. What was their goal? They have source of dissatisfaction, or they wanted to do Kanban, or what was the?
What was the motivation?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Turns out they have, they may not call them customers, but they have the equivalent of customers that they have to support, and they also have fitness criteria for that, and there are gaps, just like anywhere else, right? So, for example, they have, donors that are expecting certain information about the impact of their donations, right? And they're not getting them on time, for example, or there's not enough detail, right? So it shows up in some of those discussions. So, it's obviously a different lens on a very similar problem from businesses, but ultimately they are serving, right? Businesses serve customers. Nonprofits may serve their community, but there's a service that's taking place.
Yeah, but did they come to you that, we want to do Kanban, or did they come to you saying that, hey, we have this problem, we need your help? Like,
This particular one that we're talking about, they wanted to do Kanban.
okay,
Yeah,
so that was my question.
someone in there, someone on the team had been exposed to it some years earlier, and they were like, I think this could help.
Got it. So that was
Right.
the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to make the clarifying remark that Martin just made for me, because about 5 years before Martin started working with that particular not to be named NGO, about 5 years prior to that, Brad Hughes and I had been in touch with them, and that's how they knew that Kanban could potentially help them with their problems. But their problems were the primary motivator, not the desire to adopt Kanban. Thank you.
Great. Time for one more at least.
Hi, Martin. Thank you very much for your speech, your talk. It was very, very nice. I'm JR from Brazil, and one of the things that you said here was about maturity and leadership. Can you give us 3 tips? How can you grow the maturity and leadership?
Okay, so that's how much time do we have? So one thing is, I'll tell you what not to do, first of all right? Don't go in there trying to change their mindset, okay? So if you see a lot of, hey, we need to grow the mindset, we need to do this, you guys need to understand this, or I'm going to bring in some motivational speaker and talk about mindset and use all the mentalism that we heard earlier this week to hypnotize people on mindset. They'll get dehypnotized the next day and it won't work, right? But you still do need to change the mindset, but you can't directly do it. The mindset, you have to realize, is an outcome of what they do and their values. So if I want to have the mindset of an athlete, I can't do that if someone just comes and says, hey, Martin, you're an athlete. Clearly I'm not, right? However, maybe I have to go to the gym, and I do that practice. And then I run some marathons, and I do that practice. And I sustain it over time. That will alter my thinking and can lead to changes to my mindset to increase my maturity with relation at least to health and fitness, right? So the route to increasing maturity is about really injecting different ways of doing things. And this is kind of why the path to maturity is already laid out for you in a way as we think about going through the maturity levels one at a time. Because at each level of Kanban maturity, new practices are showing up, and you give them the opportunity to stick. The reason why we're doing one at a time is until those practices stick and develop a higher level of maturity, we won't be able to do the next ones. In the same way where I can't start to run a marathon, if I want to start to develop an athlete's mindset, I can't just start running a marathon tomorrow. I probably have to do a few other things first, right? So that wasn't like 3 tips, but like one thing not to do and then the thing that to do instead of that, all right?
Great. I think we're up against our lunchtime, so please
All right,
join us
thank
in
you,
the
everyone.
courtyard. Thank you, Martin.